Sophie's manager had her bleeding on the alley pavement when the stranger in the expensive suit ordered him to stop pushing her. And within 10 minutes, the man was fired with a single phone call. She didn't realize until much later that power like that only came from one source in Chicago, and accepting help from Alessandro Marchetti meant she'd just traded one cage for another she could never escape. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go! The rain came down in sheets that Thursday night, turning the Chicago streets into rivers of neon reflections and urban grime. I'd been on my feet for 11 hours straight, and my lower back screamed with every step I took through the kitchen doors of Marcello's Italian Bistro. The dinner rush had finally died down around 10:30, leaving behind a battlefield of dirty plates, crumpled napkin, and the lingering aroma of garlic and desperation that seemed to define my entire existence lately. My name is Sophie Chun, and at 24 years old, I'd somehow convinced myself that a degree in art history would lead to a fulfilling career in museum, curation, or gallery management. Instead, I was balancing plates of overpriced pasta for entitled customers who treated me like I was invisible until they needed something. The tips were decent though, and decent was all I could afford since my student loan payments started coming due 6 months ago. My studio apartment in Pilsen wasn't much, just 400 square feet of peeling paint and radiator heat that worked when it felt like it, but it was mine, or at least it would be mine once I paid off about $80,000 in debt. Tony Martinez had been my manager for the past 8 months, and in that time I'd learned to read his moods the way sailors read storm clouds. Tonight, those clouds were particularly dark. He'd been in a foul temper since the afternoon, snapping at servers over minor mistakes, criticizing presentation that would have passed without comment any other day. I'd watched him down 3 espressos in 2 hours, jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. Should have seen it coming. Should have recognized the signs of a man operating on a short fuse with violence simmering just beneath his carefully maintained professional veneer. But I was exhausted, focused on getting through my shift so I could collapse into bed and try to forget about the overdue electric bill sitting on my kitchen counter. The incident started over something trivial. A table of 4 businessmen had complained that their orders were taking too long, which wasn't even remotely my fault since I'd submitted their tickets to the kitchen 15 minutes earlier. But Tony had this philosophy that the customer was always right even when they were objectively wrong, and he'd called me into his office to discuss my apparent incompetence. His office was really just a converted storage closet with a desk, a filing cabinet, and barely enough room to turn around. The fluorescent light overhead flickered with an irregular rhythm that had always made me slightly nauseous. Tony stood behind his desk, his thick arms crossed over his barrel chest, while I hovered near the door trying to maintain the appropriate expression of contrition for mistakes I hadn't actually made. "This is the 3rd complaint this week about slow service," he said, his voice carrying that dangerous edge I'd learned to recognize. "3rd complaint, Sophie. What am I supposed to do with that?" I kept my tone even, professional, swallowing down the frustration that wanted to claw its way up my throat. "The kitchen has been understaffed since Marco quit 2 weeks ago. The tickets are going through at the same speed they always have, but we're short a line cook and it's showing in the timing. So you're blaming the kitchen?" His eyes narrowed and I realized too late that I'd made a tactical error. Tony didn't like it when servers suggested that problems might originate anywhere except with the front of house staff. I'm explaining the situation, not placing blame. If you look at the ticket times, you'll see that I'm actually turning tables faster than most of the other servers. The statistics were on my side, which I'd verified by checking the system reports during my break, but Tony wasn't interested in statistics. He was interested in having someone to take his frustration out on, and I'd just volunteered myself for that role. "You know what your problem is, Sophie? You think you're smarter than everyone else. You think because you went to some fancy college that you're better than this job." His voice had risen, carrying out into the kitchen where I could see other staff members pretending not to listen while they absolutely were listening. "That's not true. I do my job well, and the numbers prove it. I should have stopped there, should have just accepted whatever lecture he wanted to deliver and moved on. But I was tired, frustrated, and sick of being blamed for systemic problems that were outside my control. The numbers?" Tony's laugh was ugly, harsh, echoing in the cramped space. "Let me tell you about numbers, princess. The number I care about is whether I have enough servers to cover the weekend rush. And right now I'm thinking I might have one too many." The threat hung in the air between us, crystal clear despite never being explicitly stated. I needed this job. He knew I needed this job. The power dynamic was simple and brutal, and we both understood exactly where we stood. "I'll do better," I said, hating the words even as they left my mouth. "It won't happen again. See that it doesn't? Now get back out there and try to actually earn your paycheck for once." I turned to leave, my hand already on the doorknob, when his voice stopped me again. "And Sophie, next time you want to argue with me about kitchen problems, remember who signs your checks." The humiliation burned hot in my chest as I made my way back to the dining room, pasting on the pleasant server smile that customers expected. I had 4 tables still finishing their meals, 3 checks to process, and about an hour of side work before I could finally escape into the rainy Chicago night. I just needed to get through it without any more confrontations, without giving Tony any additional ammunition to use against me. That plan lasted approximately 15 minutes. I was clearing plates from table 7, making small talk with an elderly couple who'd been nothing but pleasant all evening, when I felt rather than saw Tony approaching. His energy preceded him, aggressive and territorial, like a storm front moving through a peaceful valley. The couple noticed too, their conversation faltering as they registered the tension emanating from my manager's approach. Sophie, his hand closed around my upper arm, fingers digging in with enough pressure to hurt a word. Now, I set down the plates I'd been holding, my professional smile never wavering despite the grip that was definitely going to leave bruises. Of course, just let me finish clearing this table and I'll meet you in the office. Not the office, outside. His grip tightened and he started pulling me toward the service entrance that led to the alley behind the restaurant. I tried to extract my arm, tried to maintain some semblance of dignity as other diners began to notice the scene unfolding before them, but Tony's hold was relentless. "Tony, please. You're hurting me." The words came out quieter than I'd intended, a plea rather than a demand, and I hated myself for the weakness they revealed. We reached the service entrance and Tony shoved the door open with his free hand, hauling me through it and into the alley beyond. The rain had intensified, coming down in cold sheets that soaked through my uniform almost immediately. The alley was poorly lit, just a single security light mounted above the door that cast more shadows than illumination, and the dumpsters lined up along one wall created pockets of absolute darkness that seemed to swallow the meager light. "You embarrassed me in there," Tony said, finally releasing my arm so he could round on me properly. "Made me look like an idiot in front of the entire kitchen staff with your attitude and your excuses." I rubbed my arm where his fingers had been, feeling the tender spots that would definitely bruise by morning. "I didn't mean to embarrass you. I was just trying to explain the situation with the service dimes." "Don't." His finger jabbed toward my face, coming close enough that I instinctively stepped back. "Don't try to spin this like you're the victim here. You've had an attitude problem since day one, acting like you're too good for this place. Educated to be serving tables like the rest of us. That's not fair. I work hard. I do my job well." My voice cracked slightly, frustration and fear creating a volatile mixture in my chest. "You want to talk about fair?" Tony stepped closer, backing me against the wet brick wall beside the dumpsters. "I'll show you fair. Fair is me firing your ungrateful ass right now and watching you try to make rent next month without this job." The rain continued its relentless assault, plastering my hair to my face and making it hard to see clearly. Tony stood too close, invading my personal space in a way that set off every alarm bell my nervous system possessed. This wasn't just about work performance anymore. This had crossed a line into something darker, more dangerous, and I found myself genuinely afraid of what might happen next in this isolated alley with only the rain as witness. "I'm sorry," I said, hoping that submission might diffuse the situation. "You're right. I'll adjust my attitude and do better." "Damn right you will." His hand shot out, palm connecting with the brick beside my head hard enough to make me flinch. "Or you'll be out on the street looking for another job, and good luck finding anyone who'll hire a server with a bad reference from their last manager." He pushed off the wall, preparing to head back inside when I made the mistake of trying to follow. My foot caught on something in the darkness, maybe a broken piece of pavement or debris from the dumpsters, and I stumbled forward. Tony turned, saw me falling, and instead of helping, his hand came up and shoved me backwards with enough force that I crashed against the wall again, pain exploding through my shoulder where it connected with the unforgiving brick. "Watch where you're going," he snarled, and this time when he pushed, it was deliberate, malicious, sending me sprawling across the wet pavement. The cold water soaked through my uniform immediately, mixing with the grime and oil that had accumulated in the alley over years of restaurant operations. My palms burned where they'd scraped against the rough asphalt, and my hip throbbed from the impact. I could taste copper in my mouth where I'd bitten my tongue during the fall, and the humiliation of my situation felt almost worse than the physical pain. Tony stood over me, his bulk blocking what little light filtered down from the security lamp. His face twisted into an expression of contempt that made him look like a stranger wearing my manager's features. For a moment, I genuinely feared he might kick me while I was down, might escalate this confrontation into something that would require a hospital visit and police reports I couldn't afford to file. "Stop pushing her." The voice came from the deeper shadows near the mouth of the alley, cultured and controlled, carrying an undertone of absolute authority that made even the rain seem to pause. Tony's head whipped around, his aggressive posture shifting immediately to something more defensive as he registered that we were no longer alone. A man emerged from the darkness, and my first coherent thought was that he looked entirely wrong for this setting. Everything about him screamed wealth and refinement, from the perfectly tailored charcoal suit that somehow remained pristine despite the downpour, to the Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than I made in a month. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with dark hair swept back from a face that could have belonged to a Renaissance sculpture, all sharp angles in classical proportion. But it was his eyes that captured my attention, even from my position on the ground. They were the color of winter storms, gray and cold and absolutely merciless as they fixed on Tony. "This doesn't concern you," Tony said, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. The bravado that had fueled his attack on me evaporated in the presence of this stranger who radiated danger the way other men radiated radiated cologne, making it my concern. The stranger moved closer, his movements fluid and predatory, closing the distance between himself and Tony with measured steps that somehow felt more threatening than any aggressive rush would have been. When a man assaults a woman in an alley, it becomes everyone's concern. She's my employee. This is a workplace discipline issue. Tony tried to assert authority he clearly didn't feel, his voice rising slightly in pitch. You need to move along before I call the police. The stranger's smile was terrifying in its coldness. By all means, call them. I'm sure they'd be very interested in hearing about how you dragged your employee into an alley and physically assaulted her. I'm certain the security cameras captured the entire incident. I glanced up at the building's exterior, spotting the small camera mounted near the door that I'd never really paid attention to before. Tony's face paled as he followed my gaze, apparently realizing for the first time that his actions had been recorded. Now, the stranger continued, his voice dropping to something even more dangerous in its quietness. You're going to help the young lady up, apologize for your behavior, and then you're going to go back inside and tender your immediate resignation, effective tonight. You can't make me quit my job. Who the hell do you think you are? But even as Tony protested, he was backing away from me, putting distance between himself and the stranger whose presence seemed to fill the entire alley with barely contained violence. I think I'm the man who's giving you a chance to walk away from this situation with your health intact. The alternative is significantly less pleasant for you. The stranger extended his hand toward me, palm up in an offer of assistance. Miss, are you injured? I took his hand, feeling the strength in his grip as he pulled me effortlessly to my feet. My legs trembled from adrenaline and shock, and I had to lean against the wall for a moment to regain my equilibrium. I'm okay. Bruised, but okay. Tony, sensing perhaps that the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably, tried one last assertion of authority. You're both crazy. I'm calling the cops right now, and we'll see what they have to say about trespassing and threatening behavior. The stranger pulled out his phone, and I noticed his hands for the first time. They were elegant, well-manicured, but marked with scars across the knuckles that suggested a history of violence despite the refined exterior. He made a brief call, speaking in rapid Italian to whoever answered, then turned his attention back to Tony with that same cold smile. I've just had a very interesting conversation with the owner of this establishment. It seems Marco Benedetti is an old family friend, and he's been looking for a reason to terminate your employment for quite some time. Multiple complaints about harassment, hostile work environment, inappropriate conduct with female staff. He says to consider yourself fired, effective immediately, and that security will escort you from the premises to collect your personal belongings. Tony's face cycled through disbelief, rage, and finally fear as patience sank in. You can't do this. I'll sue. I'll go to the labor board. You're welcome to try, but I'd suggest you spend your energy finding new employment rather than pursuing legal action you can't afford and won't win. Now, I believe you owe this young woman an apology before you leave. For a moment, I thought Tony might actually attack the stranger. His hands clenched into fists, his jaw working as he struggled with the rage and humiliation of being so thoroughly dominated. But whatever he saw in the stranger's eyes must have convinced him that violence would end very badly for him, because he deflated like a punctured balloon. Sorry, he muttered in my general direction, not quite meeting my eyes. Then he was moving toward the service entrance, nearly running in his haste to escape the alley and the man who'd so completely dismantled his authority. I stood there shivering, soaked to the bone, trying to process what had just happened. The stranger watched Tony disappear into the restaurant before turning his full attention to me, and I felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing. You're bleeding, he observed, gesturing toward my hand, and you'll need dry clothes before you catch pneumonia. I have a car waiting. I can offer you a ride home or anywhere else you need to go. Every instinct I possessed screamed warnings about accepting rides from strange men, no matter how well-dressed or apparently helpful they might be. But I was cold, hurt, and suddenly aware that I'd just watched my manager get fired through the intervention of someone who clearly wielded considerable power. Going back inside the restaurant felt impossible, and I couldn't exactly stand in this alley all night. I don't even know your name, I said, wrapping my arms around myself in a futile attempt to generate warmth. Alessandro Marchetti. He offered his hand again, this time for a proper introduction rather than assistance. My friends call me Alex, though I suspect we're not quite friends yet. I shook his hand, noting again the contrast between his refined appearance and those scarred knuckles. Sophie Chun, and thank you for intervening. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along. Something dark flickered across his features. I know exactly what would have happened. Men like your former manager escalate. Tonight was a preview of worse things to come. How do you know Marco? How did you get him to fire Tony just like that? The questions tumbled out as my brain started functioning again beyond the immediate crisis. Marco and my family have done business together for many years. When I explained the situation, he was only too happy to resolve a personnel problem that's been festering for months. Alessandro gestured toward the mouth of the alley where I could now see a sleek black sedan waiting, its engine idling quietly. Now, let me get you somewhere warm and dry. We can discuss the details of your employment situation once you're not in danger of hypothermia. My employment situation? I was still processing the events of the past 10 minutes. Trying to understand how my terrible night had transformed into something entirely different. You'll need a new job, I assume, and it happens that several of my establishments are currently hiring. But first, medical attention for those hands. dry clothes, and perhaps a hot meal. Consider it an apology for the city's failure to protect you from predators like your former manager. I should have been more suspicious, should have questioned why this impeccably dressed stranger had appeared at exactly the right moment, why he wielded enough influence to get someone fired with a single phone call, why he was so invested in the welfare of a random waitress he'd never met before. But I was cold, scared, and suddenly unemployed, and Alessandro Marchetti was offering solutions to immediate problems I couldn't solve on my own. Okay, I heard myself say, the word emerging from some place of exhausted surrender to circumstances beyond my control. Thank you. His smile transformed his face, warmth replacing the cold calculation I'd seen when he confronted Tony. Excellent. This way, Miss Chun, let's get you taken care of. The interior of Alessandro's sedan was a sanctuary of leather and subtle cologne, warm air blasting from vents that seemed positioned specifically to combat the Chicago cold. A driver sat behind the wheel, an older man with silver hair and the kind of posture that suggested military background. He didn't react when Alessandro helped me into the back seat, didn't offer any greeting or acknowledgement of my bedraggled appearance. He simply waited for instructions with the patience of someone accustomed to unusual situations. St. Joseph's emergency room, Alessandro said, settling beside me with careful distance that felt respectful rather than cold. Then we'll address Miss Chun's other needs. I really don't need an emergency room. The protest came automatically, conditioned by years of avoiding medical bills I couldn't afford. I'm fine, just scraped up a bit. Your hands are bleeding, you're favoring your left side, which suggests injured ribs, and you have abrasions on your face that should be properly cleaned to prevent infection. Humor me, Miss Chun. Consider it part of my apology for not intervening sooner. How long were you watching? The question emerged before I'd fully processed the implication. If he'd witnessed the entire confrontation with Tony, why had he waited until I was on the ground before stepping in? Long enough to understand the situation, not long enough to prevent all harm. For that, I apologized. Alessandro pulled a handkerchief from his jacket pocket, pristine white linen that he offered with a gesture toward my bleeding palms. I'd hoped your manager would show sense and restraint. He exceeded my worst expectations. I pressed the handkerchief against my right palm, watching the fabric slowly stain red. The pain was starting to register now that the adrenaline was fading. Sharp burning sensations across skin that had scraped against unforgiving pavement. You were at the restaurant earlier, table 12. You ordered the ossa buco. His eyebrows rose slightly, surprise registering on features that seemed more accustomed to maintaining careful neutrality. You have an excellent memory for customers. I have an excellent memory for people who tip 40% and make eye contact when they thank the server. Most customers treat us like furniture. You didn't. I shifted in my seat, trying to find a position that didn't aggravate my bruised ribs. So why were you really in that alley? Don't tell me you regularly patrol restaurant back exits looking for workplace disputes. Alessandro was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the Chicago streets sliding past the windows. The rain had intensified, turning the city into a blurred watercolor of lights and motion. When he finally spoke, his voice carried careful consideration, as if weighing exactly how much truth to reveal. I was meeting with Marco Benedetti about a business arrangement. When I was leaving through the service entrance, I heard the confrontation beginning. I chose to observe before intervening because I needed to understand the full scope of the situation. Had I revealed myself too soon, your manager might have simply postponed his violence for a more private moment. That's a very calculated approach to helping someone. Most people would have just called the cops. Most people don't understand how inadequate police intervention can be in situations like yours. A report would be filed, maybe an investigation conducted. But by the time anything substantive happened, you'd have been subjected to weeks or months of additional harassment. I prefer more immediate solutions. The way he said it sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with my wet clothes. There was something beneath his polished exterior, something dangerous and precise, like a blade hidden in expensive wrapping. I need to call someone, let him know I'm okay. My roommate, she'll worry if I don't come home on time. Of course. Alessandro produced a phone from his jacket, offering it to me, though I noticed you said roommate rather than boyfriend. An observation, not a question. I don't have a boyfriend. Haven't had time for dating between work and trying to figure out what to do with my very expensive and largely useless art history degree. I took his phone, noting its weight and quality, the kind of device that costs more than my monthly rent. My roommate Melissa is a law student at Northwestern. She keeps weird hours, so she probably won't even notice I'm late, but I should text her anyway. Art history. Alessandro's tone suggested genuine interest rather than the polite dismissal most people offered when they learned my field of study. Specialization. Italian Renaissance, focusing on the intersection of art and political power in 5th-10th century Florence. I typed out a quick message to Melissa as I spoke, explaining that I'd had an incident at work but was fine and would be home later than expected. It's a fascinating period, all these wealthy families using art as propaganda and status symbol, commissioning works that would cement their legacies for centuries. The Medici understood power in ways that modern families have forgotten. They knew that control wasn't just about force, but about shaping culture, influencing perception, creating narratives that outlasted their lifetimes. His voice carried an edge of something I couldn't quite identify, nostalgia perhaps, or recognition of patterns repeating across centuries. You sound like you've studied the period yourself. I handed back his phone, our fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through me, awareness of him as something more than just my rescuer. I've made it a point to understand the history of power, particularly Italian power structures. My family has deep roots in that tradition, though we've evolved considerably from Renaissance methods. Alessandro's smile was enigmatic, revealing nothing while suggesting everything. We arrived at St. Joseph's, the emergency room entrance blazing with fluorescent light that seemed harsh after the intimacy of the car's interior. The medical examination was thorough and uncomfortable. A young resident with kind eyes cleaned my wounds, applied antibiotic ointment, and wrapped my hands in gauze that made me feel like a boxer preparing for a match. My ribs were bruised but not broken, my face would heal without scarring, and I was given prescriptions for pain medication and antibiotics that I had no idea how I'd afford. Alessandro handled everything. The registration paperwork, the insurance questions, even the pharmaceutical costs that would have sent me into financial panic. He did it with such casual efficiency that it took me several minutes to realize I'd essentially allowed a complete stranger to access my personal information and assume financial responsibility for my medical care. "You didn't have to do all this," I said as we left the hospital 2 hours later. "I can pay you back eventually. It might take a while, but I always pay my debts." "There's no debt, Miss Chun. Consider it an investment." He guided me back to the waiting sedan where the silent driver still waited with infinite patience. "Now we address the matter of dry clothes and food. My apartment is nearby, and I can offer you something more comfortable to wear while your uniform is cleaned and dried." Every self-preservation instinct the first possessed should have been screaming warnings. Going to a strange man's apartment, no matter how helpful he'd been, violated every rule of urban survival I'd learned during 6 years in Chicago. But Alessandro Marchetti didn't feel dangerous in the conventional sense. He felt dangerous in an entirely different way, like standing at the edge of a precipice and feeling the pull of empty air. I should probably just go home. My voice lacked conviction even to my own ears. "You should probably eat something warm, change into clothes that won't give you pneumonia, and allow yourself a moment to process what happened tonight before returning to your apartment alone." Alessandro's tone was gentle but firm, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm not suggesting anything inappropriate, Miss Chun. Simply practical assistance from someone who finds himself unexpectedly concerned about your well-being." "Why?" The question burst out before I could stop it. "Why do you care what happens to me? You don't know me. I'm just some random waitress who got roughed up by her manager. This level of intervention doesn't make sense unless there's something else going on." His expression shifted, becoming something more genuine beneath the polished exterior. "Perhaps I see something in you that reminds me of someone I once knew. Perhaps I'm simply tired of watching powerful men abuse those with less power. Or perhaps I'm exactly the kind of person who can't walk past injustice without intervening. Consequences be damned. Does my motivation really matter if the outcome is the same?" I studied his face in the dim light of the sedan's interior, trying to reconcile the refined businessman with the man who'd confronted Tony with such casual menace. There were layers here, complexities I couldn't begin to unravel after one dramatic encounter. But I was cold, exhausted, and suddenly aware of how empty my refrigerator was back at my apartment. 1 hour, I said, making a decision that would alter the trajectory of my entire life, though I couldn't know it yet. "I'll accept dry clothes and food, then I need to go home and figure out how to pay rent without a job." Alessandro's smile held satisfaction and something else I couldn't quite name. 1 hour, though I suspect once you see what I'm offering, you might want to extend that timeline. He gave the driver an address in a neighborhood I recognized as one of Chicago's most exclusive areas, where apartments started at 7 figures and door attendants wore uniforms nicer than anything in my closet. The building that Alessandro called home rose 40 stories above Lake Michigan, all glass and steel and architectural ambition that spoke of wealth beyond anything I'd encountered in my 24 years. A doorman materialized the moment our sedan pulled up to the entrance, appearing with an umbrella, despite the fact that we'd be covered by the awning for the 3 steps it took to reach the lobby. He greeted Alessandro by name, his deference absolute but not obsequious, the respect of someone who understood exact was serving. The lobby was a study in understated luxury, all marble floors and modern art installations that probably cost more than most people's houses. A security desk staffed by 2 men in immaculate suits monitored an array of screens showing various angles of the building's exterior and interior. They nodded to Alessandro as we passed, their gazes sliding over me with professional neutrality that suggested they were accustomed to their employer bringing home unexpected guests. We took a private elevator that required a keycard to access, rising through the building with smooth efficiency while soft classical music played from hidden speakers. I caught my reflection in the polished metal walls and winced. My hair hung in wet tangles around my face, my uniform was stained and torn, and the gauze wrapped around my hands made me look like I'd lost a fight with a cheese grater. Next to Alessandro's immaculate appearance, I resembled something the cat had dragged in and then reconsidered. The elevator opened directly into Alessandro's apartment, and I stepped into a space that redefined my understanding of luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Chicago's skyline, line and the dark expanse of Lake Michigan beyond, the city lights reflecting off the water like scattered diamonds. The interior was decorated with the kind of restrained elegance that whispered old money, expensive furniture arranged in conversation grouping, artwork that I recognized from my studies adorning walls painted in neutral tones that somehow felt warm rather than cold. Is that an original Caravaggio? I moved toward a painting hung in a place of honor above a marble fireplace, forgetting my discomfort in the presence of art I'd only seen in textbooks and museum catalogs. The dramatic use of light and shadow, the psychological intensity of the subject's gaze, it had to be from his Roman period, maybe early 1600s. Alessandro moved to stand beside me, his attention on the painting rather than my reaction to it. Judith beheading Holofernes, painted in 1602, purchased by my great-grandfather in 1938 from a German collector who needed to liquidate assets quickly. My family has maintained a rather extensive art collection over the generations. This should be in a museum. The words came out as barely a whisper, reverence and shock mixing in equal measure. Do you have any idea what this is worth? Approximately $45 million at current market valuations, though I'd never sell it. Some things are more valuable as inheritance than as liquid assets. He gestured toward a hallway leading deeper into the apartment. The guest suite is this way. You'll find a selection of clothing in the closet, various sizes from when my sister visits. Take whatever fits and feels comfortable. The bathroom is stocked with everything you might need. You keep a wardrobe of women's clothing just in case you rescue soaking wet waitresses. I tried for humor, but my voice came out strained, overwhelmed by the casual display of wealth surrounding me. I keep it because my sister is terrible at planning ahead and frequently arrives without appropriate attire for Chicago weather. That you might benefit from her oversight is simply fortunate timing. Alessandro's smile was gentle, understanding my discomfort even if he couldn't entirely relate to it. Take your time, Miss Chun. I'll prepare something to eat while you make yourself comfortable. The guest suite was larger than my entire apartment, decorated in soothing blues and creams that felt both expensive and welcoming. The bathroom featured a rainfall shower that probably used more water in 5 minutes than I typically consumed in a week, and the closet was indeed stocked with clothing that bore designer labels I recognized from window shopping expeditions I could never afford to turn into actual purchases. I selected black leggings and an oversized cashmere sweater in deep gray, both of which fit well enough despite my curves being slightly more generous than Alessandro's sisters apparently were. The clothing was soft against my skin, luxurious in a way that made my usual Target purchases feel like burlap by comparison. I attempted to do something with my hair, but the provided hair dryer and styling products could only do so much with the disaster the rain had created. When I emerged 20 minutes later, I found Alessandro in the kitchen, which was separated from the main living area by a massive island topped with what looked like Carrara marble. He'd removed his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms marked with more of those scars I'd noticed on his hands. He was moving through the space with practiced efficiency, apparently preparing a meal from scratch rather than ordering takeout as I'd expected. I hope you're not vegetarian, he said without looking up from whatever he was sorting in a copper pan. I'm making a simple pasta with olive oil, garlic, and chili flakes. Nothing fancy, but it's comfort food and you look like you could use some comfort. That sounds perfect. I settled onto one of the bar stools lining the island, watching him work with the kind of casual competence that suggested this wasn't performative. He actually knew how to cook, his movements economical and confident. You didn't strike me as the type to prepare his own meals. I spent 2 years working in my uncle's restaurant in Rome when I was younger. He believed that understanding every aspect of a business from the kitchen to the books was essential to running it successfully. Alessandro added pasta to boiling water, tasting and adjusting seasonings with the focus of someone for whom cooking was both skill and meditation. I learned more about human nature working in that kitchen than I did in 4 years of university. What did you study? I was piecing together a picture of this man that didn't quite cohere, elements that seemed to contradict each other in ways I couldn't reconcile. Business and economics at Yale, followed by a law degree I never actually used for traditional practice. My family has extensive business interests that require understanding of complex legal and financial structures. Alessandro plated the pasta with artistic precision, drizzling olive oil and adding fresh basil leaves as garnish before setting it before me. The educational credentials were useful, but most of what I needed to know I learned from my father and grandfather. The pasta was extraordinary, simple ingredients elevated by perfect execution. I hadn't realized how hungry I was until the first bite hit my system, and suddenly I was eating with the enthusiasm of someone who'd skipped lunch and had their dinner interrupted by workplace assault. Alessandro watched me with what might have been amusement or satisfaction, sipping wine from a glass he'd poured for himself while leaving my place setting deliberately alcohol-free. You mentioned your family has business interests, I said between bites, fishing for information about exactly who Alessandro Marchetti was. and why he wielded the kind of power that could get someone fired with a phone call. What kind of business? Import and export primarily. Also several restaurants and hospitality establishments throughout the city. Real estate development. Various investment portfolios. He was being deliberately vague, I realized, offering information that sounded detailed while actually revealing nothing substantive. And Marco Benedetti, the owner of Marcello's, is part of your business network. It was a statement rather than a question, testing to see how he'd respond to direct inquiry. Marco and my family have had a mutually beneficial relationship for many years. When I explained your situation, he was happy to address a personnel problem that had been creating liability issues for his establishment. Tony Martinez had multiple complaints filed against him, several near misses with lawsuits. Firing him was good business regardless of tonight's incident, but you made it happen with one phone call at 11 o'clock at night. That's not normal business relationships, Alessandro. That's the kind of influence that comes from something else entirely. His expression shifted slightly, approval flickering across his features like he'd been waiting to see if I'd push beyond the comfortable fiction he was offering. You're perceptive, Miss Chun. I appreciate that quality, though it can be dangerous if not tempered with discretion. Are you going to tell me what you really do, or are we going to keep dancing around it with euphemisms about business interests and family relationships? Alessandro set down his wine glass, leaning forward slightly, his full attention focused on me with an intensity that made my breath catch. What I'm going to tell you, Sophie, is that my family operates in a very specific sphere of influence that values loyalty, discretion, and capability above all else. We solve problems for people, provide protection for those who need it, and maintain certain standards of conduct within our areas of interest. Some might describe what we do as criminal enterprise. I prefer to think of it as maintaining order in spaces where traditional law enforcement is inadequate or corrupt. You're in the Mafia. The words came out flat, stating what should have been obvious from the moment he confronted Tony with such casual menace. Alessandro Marchetti wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He was something far more dangerous. That term is outdated and inaccurate, carrying connotations of violence and illegality that don't reflect modern operation. We're a family business with traditional values, extensive networks, and the ability to operate efficiently in areas where bureaucracy fails. His tone suggested this was a distinction he'd made many times before. Defensive about terminology even while acknowledging the essential truth beneath it. I should have been terrified. Every rational instinct should have been screaming at me to leave immediately, to put as much distance as possible between myself and a man who just casually admitted to being part of organized crime. Instead, I found myself setting down my fork and meeting his gaze with a steadiness that surprised us both. So tonight in that alley, you weren't just being a good Samaritan. You were making a calculation, assessing whether I might be useful to your organization, seeing if I was worth the investment of your time and resources. Alessandro didn't look away, didn't offer platitudes or denials. I was making several calculations simultaneously, whether you were worth protecting, whether you had qualities that might prove valuable, whether you were intelligent enough to understand what I was offering without requiring explicit explanation. You're passing all those tests rather admirably. And what exactly are you offering? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like I've gone from one dangerous situation with my manager to a potentially much more dangerous situation with you. Fair assessment. He stood, moving around the island to lean against it from my side, close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with the garlic and olive oil from our dinner. What I'm offering is employment in one of my legitimate establishments, a position that would utilize your education and analytical skills rather than wasting them on carrying plates. Protection from men like Tony Martinez and worse. Access to resources that would allow you to pay off your student loans within 2 years rather than 20. And in exchange, there's always an exchange in arrangements like this. In exchange, you work for me. You maintain absolute discretion about everything you see and hear. You understand that loyalty to the family is paramount, and that betrayal carries consequences that are swift and permanent. His voice had dropped lower, taking on an edge that reminded me this man had confronted Tony with the casual certainty of someone accustomed to violence. I don't make these offers lightly, Sophie. The people I bring into my circle become family, but family obligations run deep. I thought about my studio apartment with its peeling paint and unreliable heat, about the stack of bills on my kitchen counter that I shuffled around each month, paying the most urgent while others accumulated late fees, about my art history degree that had cost me $80,000 and qualified me for exactly nothing in the current job market, about the 6 years I'd spent in Chicago chasing a dream that seemed to move further away with each passing month. What kind of position are you talking about? I heard myself ask, even as some distant part of my brain screamed that I was making a terrible mistake. Alessandro's smile suggested he'd known I would ask, that my capitulation had been inevitable from the moment he'd helped me off that alley pavement. One of my restaurants needs a manager with an understanding of art, culture, and the kind of refined clientele that appreciates both. Someone who can read people, assess their motivations, identify potential problems before they escalate. Your education gives you credibility with the legitimate patron. Your desperation makes you willing to overlook the less legitimate aspects of the operation. You want me to manage a front for criminal activity. The bluntness of my statement hung in the air between us. I want you to manage a highly successful restaurant that serves exceptional food to paying customers while also providing a secure, location for business meetings that require privacy and discretion. Most of what happens there is entirely legal. The small percentage that isn't, well, that's where your willingness to maintain discretion becomes valuable. How small a percentage are we talking about? I needed to understand exactly what I'd be agreeing to, what lines I'd be crossing if I accepted his offer. Small enough that you could maintain plausible deniability if questioned by authorities. Large enough that you'd be compensated well beyond standard restaurant management salaries. Alessandro moved back around the island, giving me space to think without the pressure of his proximity. I'm not asking you to participate in anything illegal, Sophie. I'm asking you to run a business and not ask many questions about certain customers or certain conversations that might occur in private dining rooms. And if I say no, if I thank you for dinner, take my dry clothes and go back to my apartment to figure out my life without your help, then I'll have my driver take you home safely and you'll never hear from me again. You'll find another waitressing job that probably treats you marginally better than Marcelo's did. You'll continue struggling with debt and dead-end prospects. And in 5 years, you'll look back and wonder what might have happened if you'd been brave enough to take a chance. His words were delivered without judgment, simply stating facts that we both knew were accurate. Or I say yes, and in 5 years, I look back from a federal prison cell wondering why I was stupid enough to get involved with organized crime for money I didn't need. If you end up in prison, it means I've failed to protect. That's not an outcome I accept for people under my care. Alessandro's voice carried absolute conviction, the certainty of someone who'd never failed at anything he'd committed to protecting. Ask yourself this, Sophie. Do I seem like a man who leaves loose ends? Who allows people he values to be compromised by inadequate planning? I studied him across the Marble Island, this man who'd inserted himself into my life with such dramatic timing. He was right about so many things. I was desperate, underemployed, drowning in debt with no realistic prospects for improvement. The legitimate economy had chewed me up and spit me out, leaving me serving pasta to people who barely acknowledged my existence. What Alessandro was offering was a lifeline, even if that lifeline came with complications that could destroy me. I need time to think about this. I can't make a decision like this after the night I've had. With my brain scrambled and my judgment compromised by trauma and excellent pasta, reasonable. He pulled a business card from his wallet, setting it on the counter between us. Take 3 days. If you decide you're interested, call that number and I'll arrange a formal interview at the restaurant. If I don't hear from you by Monday evening, I'll know you've chosen a different path and I'll respect that decision. I picked up the card, noting its weight and quality, the embossed lettering that simply read Alessandro Marchetti with a phone number below. No company name, no title, nothing that would identify his business interests to casual observers. Just a name and a number. Minimalist and elegant like everything else about him. What's the restaurant called? I asked, pocketing the card. Bellissimo. It's in River North, upscale Italian, focused on northern regional. We're currently rated as one of the top 10 Italian restaurants in Chicago, and we maintain that rating through exceptional food, service, and attention to detail. The current manager is transitioning to a position with one of our other properties, which creates an opening for someone with your particular combination of skills. You're very confident that I have skills you need based on one conversation over emergency room visits and pasta. I'm confident because I've been watching you work at Marcelo's for the past 6 weeks. Alessandro's admission should have felt creepy, stalkerish, but his tone suggested professional evaluation rather than personal obsession. I needed to fill this position, and I needed someone who could handle both the legitimate and illegitimate aspects of the operation. You demonstrated intelligence, discretion, excellent customer service skills, and the ability to read social dynamic. When I saw what was happening tonight, it simply accelerated a recruitment timeline I'd already established. You've been planning this. The whole intervention, the hospital, bringing me here, all of it was calculated to put me in a position where accepting your offer seemed like the only rational choice. I've been creating an opportunity. Whether you choose to accept it remains entirely your decision. Alessandro's expression suggested he found my accusation more complimentary than critical. I don't force people into my organization, Sophie. I present options and allow them to make informed choices about their futures. What happened tonight was unfortunate, but it also revealed character traits I'd suspected but hadn't confirmed. You stood up to someone who had power over you despite knowing it could cost you your job. That takes courage, or stupidity. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. Courage and stupidity often look identical in the moment. It's only in hindsight that we can distinguish between them. He moved toward the living area, settling onto one of the expensive sofas with the ease of someone completely comfortable in his environment. Let me tell you something about my family's business, Sophie. We've survived for 4 generations because we understand value in all its forms. Financial value, certainly, but also the value of loyalty, intelligence, discretion, and capability. People who possess those qualities are rare, and when we find them, we invest heavily in their success. Because their success becomes your success. Precisely. Which means I have every incentive to ensure you thrive in this position, that you're protected, compensated fairly, given opportunities to grow beyond your current limitations. I'm not offering exploitation dressed up as opportunity. I'm offering genuine partnership within a structure that can provide stability and advancement impossible to achieve through conventional means. I spent 3 days in a state of suspended animation, moving through the motions of my life while my brain churned through the implications of Alessandro's offer. Melissa noticed my distraction immediately, her law school training making her particularly attuned to behavioral changes in her roommate. When I deflected her questions with vague explanations about the incident at work, she pressed harder until I finally told her a version of the truth: that a customer had intervened when my manager got violent, that I'd lost my job, and that I was considering a new opportunity that felt both promising and potentially dangerous. What kind of dangerous? She'd asked, sitting cross-legged on our threadbare couch with a mug of tea cooling in her hand, her dark eyes sharp with concern. The kind where I'm not entirely sure what I'd be getting into, but the compensation would solve a lot of problems very quickly. I'd chosen my words carefully, unwilling to explicitly mention organized crime, but needing her perspective on the ethical dimensions of my choice. Sophie, nothing that pays enough to solve all your problems quickly is ever legitimate. You know that, right? Her tone carried the weight of someone who'd spent 3 years studying the law and understood exactly how wealth was really accumulated in America. Whatever this opportunity is, you need to consider whether the short-term financial relief is worth the long-term consequences. But what if the long-term consequences of not taking it are worse? What if I spend the next 20 years struggling, never getting ahead, watching my degree become increasingly irrelevant while I serve pasta to people who don't even see me as human? At what point does the conventional path become its own kind of prison? Melissa had been quiet for a long moment, processing my words with the careful consideration that made her an excellent future attorney. Then she'd said something that stayed with me for the rest of my deliberation period. The conventional path is a prison that society calls virtue. The unconventional path is freedom that society calls crime. Neither choice is inherently moral or immoral. What matters is whether you can live with the consequences of whichever you choose. I called Alessandro on Sunday evening, 3 days after our dinner, and right at the deadline he'd specified. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying none of the surprise that might have accompanied an unexpected call. Miss Chun, I've been hoping to hear from you. I'd like to schedule that interview for the restaurant manager position. My voice was steadier than I felt, projecting confidence I didn't entirely possess. Excellent. Are you available tomorrow evening? Say 7 o'clock at Bellissimo. I'll give you a tour of the facility, introduce you to key staff members, and we can discuss compensation and expectation detail. I'll be there. I'd already looked up the restaurant online, noting its glowing reviews and upscale positioning in Chicago's competitive dining scene. The website showed elegant interiors, sophisticated plating, prices that made Marcello's look like a budget option. Wonderful. Dress professionally, but not too formally. This is hospitality, not bank. I'll have someone at the host stand expecting you. Alessandro paused, and I could hear what sounded like papers rustling in the background. Sophie, I'm glad you decided to pursue this opportunity. I think you'll find it suits you better than you expect. After we disconnected, I sat staring at my phone for a long time, thinking about the point of no return and whether I'd already crossed it, or if tomorrow evening would be when I irrevocably changed the trajectory of my life. Bellissimo occupied a corner location in River North with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered pedestrians glimpses of the elegant interior. One arrived 15 minutes early, nervous energy driving me to circle the block twice before finally entering through heavy wooden doors that whispered money with every detail of their construction. The host stand was positioned just inside, manned by a young woman in a black dress that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. You must be Sophie Chun. Alessandro is expecting you. Please follow me. She moved through the dining room with practiced grace, and I found myself cataloging details with the analytical eye I'd developed during my art history studies. The restaurant was beautiful in an understated way, cream walls accented with dark wood trim, contemporary light fixtures that somehow managed to feel both modern and timeless, and original artwork that I recognized as coming from various 20th century Italian artists. Alessandro was waiting in a private dining room at the back of the restaurant, seated at a table set for two with what appeared to be a full dinner service ready. He stood when I entered, his suit a shade of charcoal that probably had a specific Italian name I didn't know. His appearance as impeccable as it had been that rainy night 3 days earlier. Sophie, thank you for coming. Please sit. I thought we could discuss business over dinner, since that seems to be when we do our best communicating. His smile suggested shared intimacy, a callback to our previous meal that created artificial familiarity. This is beautiful. I gestured at the dining room, the restaurant beyond, the entire establishment that hummed with quiet efficiency. You've built something impressive here. My grandfather built it 50 years ago. I've simply maintained his vision while modernizing operations to suit contemporary expectations. Alessandro poured wine for both of us, a Barolo that probably cost more per bottle than I'd made in tips on a good night. The restaurant has always been family business in the most literal sense. My mother worked the host stand, my uncles managed the kitchen, my father handled the books and the more delicate aspects of our operations. The delicate aspects being the criminal enterprise that funded everything else. The supplementary income streams that allowed us to weather economic downturns and maintain quality standards that would otherwise be financially impossible. His correction was gentle but firm, reframing criminal activity as pragmatic business strategy. Every restaurant in this city operates on thin margins, Sophie. The ones that survive for generations do so because they have financial cushions that conventional revenue streams alone cannot provide. A server appeared with our first course, a delicate arrangement of cured meats and aged cheeses that demonstrated the kind of attention to detail that earned Michelin recommendations. She set the plates before us with practiced efficiency and disappeared without a word, clearly instructed not to interrupt what was obviously a private conversation. Let me be explicit about what this position entails. Alessandro cut a thin slice of prosciutto, his movements economical and precise. You would manage daily restaurant operations, oversee staff, handle customer relations, coordinate with our executive chef on menu development, and maintain the standards that have made Bellissimo successful. These are all entirely legitimate responsibilities that would occupy 90% of your time and attention. And the other 10%? The other 10% involves managing our private dining rooms, which are available by reservation to select clientele who value privacy and discretion. You would coordinate these reservations through me personally, ensure that the rooms are secured during use, and maintain absolute silence about any conversations or activities you might inadvertently witness. You would not be asked to participate in anything illegal, simply to facilitate meetings and look the other way when appropriate. Define appropriate. I needed specifics, needed to understand exactly where the lines would be drawn and how far over them I'd be expected to look. Appropriate means recognizing that sometimes men conducting business prefer to do so, away from electronic surveillance and curious ears, that certain negotiations are sensitive enough to require absolute privacy, that the restaurant provides a neutral ground where parties who might not trust each other can meet under guaranteed safety. Alessandro's voice was matter-of-fact, describing arrangements that were clearly routine for him. You would never be asked to handle money, drugs, weapons, or any other contraband. You would never be required to provide false testimony or destroy evidence. You would simply be a manager who understands that some customers value discretion above all else and who ensures they receive it, and the compensation for providing this discretion. I'd looked up average restaurant manager salaries in Chicago, knew what conventional employment would pay for this position. Base salary of $120,000 annually, plus a percentage of overall restaurant profits that typically adds another $30,000 to $40,000, full health insurance, 4 weeks paid vacation, and a discretionary bonus structure based on performance that could potentially double your base compensation. Alessandro delivered these numbers with the casual confidence of someone for whom money was simply a tool rather than an obsession. You would also have access to an apartment in a building I own in Lincoln Park, rent-free for the first 2 years while you establish yourself and eliminate your student debt. The numbers were staggering, more money than I'd ever imagined making with my art history degree, enough to transform my life from constant financial anxiety to actual stability within months rather than decades. I set down my wine glass carefully, aware that my hands were trembling slightly, and not wanting Alessandro to see how profoundly his offer had affected me. That's extremely generous. Too generous for just managing a restaurant and looking the other way occasionally. What aren't you telling me about this position? Alessandro leaned back in his chair, studying me with those storm gray eyes that seemed to see through whatever facades I attempted to maintain. You're right to be suspicious. The compensation reflects not just the work itself, but the risk you'd be assuming by associating with my organization. If law enforcement ever decided to investigate our operations, you'd be questioned simply by virtue of your position. The apartment and the financial cushion are insurance, ensuring you have resources to protect yourself legally if that becomes necessary. So I'd need a lawyer on retainer. That's what you're really saying. You'd have access to the family's legal team, who are among the best criminal defense attorneys. But more importantly, you'd have the protection of the Marchetti name, which carries considerable weight in this city. People who work for me don't face harassment from corrupt cops or aggressive prosecutors without significant pushback. His tone suggested this protection was both genuine and substantial, that the Marchetti family's influence extended into law enforcement and judicial systems in ways I could barely comprehend. The second course arrived, a perfectly executed risotto with saffron and shaved black truffle that probably cost more per serving than I used to spend on groceries in a week. We ate in contemplative silence for several minutes while I processed everything Alessandro had laid out with such careful precision. Can I ask you something personal? I finally said, setting down my fork to meet his gaze directly. You can ask. Whether I answer depends on the question. Why me? You must have dozens of people better qualified for this position, people who already understand your world and wouldn't require this kind of careful recruitment. Why invest so much time and resources in someone with no experience in either fine dining management or organized crime? Alessandro was quiet for a long moment, his expression shifting into something more vulnerable than I'd seen from him before. The carefully maintained control slipping just enough to reveal actual human uncertainty beneath. Do you know what the hardest thing is about the life I lead? It's not the violence, not the risk of arrest or assassination, not even the moral compromises that keep me awake some nights. It's the isolation. Everyone in my world wants something from me, fears me, or is calculating how to use me for their own advancement. Genuine connection becomes nearly impossible when everyone you meet is performing for you. And you think I'm not performing? That I'm somehow more authentic than the people already in your circle? I think you're desperate enough to be honest, intelligent enough to understand nuance, and moral enough to struggle with the choices you'll have to make. Those qualities are rare and valuable, particularly in combination. He reached across the table, his hand covering mine briefly before withdrawing, the contact electric and fleeting. I need someone who can operate in both worlds, legitimate and otherwise, who can charm wealthy patrons over dinner and then forget the conversations they overhear in private rooms. Someone who's educated enough to recognize a Caravaggio, but practical enough not to judge the methods by which it was acquired. You need someone who understands art isn't separate from power, that the two have always been intertwined. I thought back to my studies of the Medici, the way they'd used art patronage to cement political dominance. How Lorenzo the Magnificent had understood that controlling culture meant controlling society itself. That's what you really saw in me at Marcello's, wasn't it? Not just a desperate waitress, but someone who studied the historical relationship between wealth, power, and cultural capital. Alessandro's smile was genuine. Delighted recognition of someone who finally understood what he'd been trying to articulate. Exactly. Most people in my organization understand money and force. Very few understand how influence actually works at the highest levels of society, how the right painting in the right location can open doors that money alone cannot access. You have knowledge that's valuable in ways you haven't recognized yet. The rest of the dinner passed in detailed discussion of operational procedures, staff management expectation, and the specific protocols that govern the private dining. Alessandro was thorough, walking me through scenarios that might arise and how I should handle them. A customer who wanted to conduct business during regular dining hours would be politely redirected to private rooms. Anyone asking detailed questions about other customers or reservation patterns would be noted and reported to Alessandro immediately. Any conversation I overheard would be forgotten the moment I left the room, complete amnesia enforced by both professional discretion and survival instinct. "When do you need an answer?" I asked as the server cleared our dessert plates, a deconstructed tiramisu that had been almost too beautiful to eat. "I need your answer now, Soph." Alessandro's tone was gentle but firm. "I've laid out everything as explicitly as I can without violating operational security. You either trust me enough to take this leap or you don't. There's no middle ground in this decision." I thought about Melissa's words, about conventional prisons and unconventional freedom. I thought about my studio apartment and my crushing debt in the 6 years I'd spent chasing a dream that the legitimate economy had thoroughly destroyed. I thought about Tony Martinez pushing me into that alley, about how powerless I'd felt until Alessandro had intervened with the kind of authority that conventional channels could never provide. When do I start? The words emerged with more certainty than I felt. Commitment to a path I couldn't fully see, but somehow knew was the only way forward. Tomorrow evening, I'll have our current manager, David, work with you for the next 2 weeks to ensure a smooth transition. The apartment will be ready for you by the end of the week. Alessandro pulled out his phone, typing rapidly. "I'm sending you a contract via encrypted email. Read it carefully, have it reviewed by an attorney if you'd like, though I'd suggest using someone outside your usual circle for documents. Sign it and return within 48 hours. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of practical details and formal introduction. David Reyes turned out to be a compact man in his mid-40s with silver threading through his dark hair and the efficient demeanor of someone who'd managed high-end restaurants for decades. He walked me through Bellissimo's operations with professional thoroughness, showing me the kitchen, the wine cellar, the storage areas, and finally the private dining rooms that represented the real reason for my employment. There were 3 of them, each decorated with the same understated elegance as the main dining room, but featuring soundproofing panels disguised as decorative wall treatments and doors that locked from the inside with solid bolts that would prevent unexpected interruptions. Each room had its own service entrance from the kitchen, allowing discreet delivery of meals without passing through public spaces. "You'll get used to the rhythm," David said as we stood in the largest of the private rooms, a space that could accommodate parties of up to 12. "The private bookings usually come through Alessandro directly, usually with at least 24 hours notice, though sometimes it's more last minute. Your job is to ensure everything runs smoothly and that whatever happens in these rooms stays in these rooms. Don't speculate, don't gossip, don't even acknowledge these meetings exist once they're over." "Has it ever been dangerous?" I asked, running my hand along the polished wood of the dining table. "Have you ever felt like you were facilitating something that crossed lines you couldn't accept?" David was quiet for a moment, weighing how honest to be with someone who was about to replace him. "Once, Maybe 5 years ago, there was a meeting that got heated. Voices raised, threats exchanged, and I genuinely worried it might escalate into violence. But Alessandro was here that night and he shut it down before anything serious happened. That's the thing you need to understand about working for him. He maintains standards even in the gray areas. There are rules, boundaries that don't get crossed in his establishments. You're safer here than you'd be at most legitimate restaurants. Why are you leaving? If this is such a good position, why transition to something else? My daughter's getting married in Rome next year. Alessandro is setting me up with management of a restaurant in Florence, closer to where my family lives. It's a promotion and a homecoming simultaneously. His smile was genuine, affection for his employer evident in his expression. The Marchetti family takes care of loyalty, Sophie. Remember that when things get complicated, if you're loyal to them, they'll be loyal to you in ways that transcend conventional employment relationships. I left Bellissimo that night with a head full of information and a heart full of uncertainty. The contract arrived in my encrypted email at midnight. 10 pages of legal language that essentially boiled down to absolute discretion enforced by financial penalties and unspecified consequences for breach. I read it 3 times, sent it to Melissa for her legal opinion with identifying details removed, and finally signed it at 3 in the morning while sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of cheap wine and a sense of stepping off a cliff into darkness. Melissa's assessment came back the next morning with a text that simply said, "This is airtight and terrifying. Whoever drafted this knows exactly how to protect their interests while making enforcement unappealable. Be careful." My first official night at Bellissimo was a study in controlled chaos that somehow appeared effortless to customers. The dinner service ran with the precision of a Swiss watch, each staff member performing their role with practiced efficiency that came from years of working together under David's management. I shadowed him throughout the evening, learning the subtle signals that indicated when a table needed attention, how to read the kitchen's timing to coordinate courses perfectly, the art of managing expectations for customers who had waited months for reservations. The front-of-house staff treated me with polite professionalism that didn't quite mask their assessment of whether I'd be an improvement over David or a disaster that would disrupt their carefully calibrated system. But it was the private dining rooms that revealed the true nature of my new employment. Around 8:30, Alessandro arrived through the kitchen entrance with 4 men in expensive suits, their demeanor suggesting this was business rather than pleasure. David caught my attention with a subtle gesture, and I followed him to observe the protocol for private booking. "Private room 2 is reserved for the evening," David said quietly as we stood in the kitchen corridor. 4 guests, 5-course tasting menu, wine pairing selected by Alessandro personally. Service will be minimal, only when summoned by the call button room. No interruptions unless there's an emergency. I watched him prepare the service cart with meticulous attention to detail, arranging plates and utensils with the precision of someone who understood that perfection was the only acceptable standard. What if I hear something while delivering courses? Something that sounds illegal or dangerous? You heard nothing. You saw nothing. Your only focus is ensuring the food is presented properly and the wine glasses remain filled. David's voice was firm, the friendly mentor replaced by someone conveying essential survival information. The moment you leave that room, whatever was said ceases to exist in your memory. This isn't about morality, Sophie. It's about staying alive and keeping your job. I delivered the first course myself, knocking twice before entering with the service cart. The conversation stopped immediately as I entered, 4 sets of eyes assessing me with varying degrees of interest and suspicion. Alessandro sat at the head of the table, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp as he tracked my movement through the room. "Gentlemen, this is Sophie Chun, our new manager. She's learning our protocols tonight under David's supervision." Alessandro's introduction was casual but carried undertones of ownership, establishing that I was under his protection and therefore not to be harassed or questioned. "Sophie, please serve our appetizers and refresh the wine." I moved through the service with hands that remained remarkably steady despite my racing heart, presenting each plate with brief descriptions of the ingredients and preparation methods that David had drilled into me over the past week. The men at the table barely acknowledged me except for one who watched with predatory interest that made my skin crawl. When I'd finished and retreated to the door, I heard their conversation resume in Italian, voices low and intense, discussing matters I deliberately didn't try to translate despite 4 years of Italian language classes during my undergraduate studies. Back in the kitchen, I found David reviewing orders for the main dining room with the executive chef. He looked up as I approached, reading something in my expression that made him nod approvingly. "First time is always the hardest. It gets easier once you understand that they're just men conducting business, no different than corporate executives negotiating contracts. They just happen to be negotiating in cash rather than stock options." The man on Alessandro's right, the one who was staring, does he always do that with female staff? Vittorio Russo is a pig who thinks his money entitles him to treat women as possessions, but he's also Alessandro's third cousin and represents family interests in the northern suburbs, which means tolerating his behavior within boundaries. David's voice carried disgust that suggested this wasn't the first time Vittorio's conduct had been an issue. Alessandro is aware of his cousin's tendencies and ensures they don't cross certain lines. If Vittorio makes you uncomfortable, mention it to Alessandro Alessandro directly. He's protective of his people, particularly women under his employment. The evening progressed through multiple courses, each delivery to Private Room 2 revealing fragments of conversation that I dutifully ignored as instructed. I caught mentions of territories and percentages, disputes about distribution channels and territories, references to people and places that meant nothing to me but clearly carried significant weight for the men in that room. By the time I delivered dessert around 11, the tension that had marked the earlier courses had replaced by the satisfaction of men who'd reached agreements beneficial to all parties. Alessandro caught me in the kitchen corridor as I was helping David prepare the final coffee service. "A word, Sophie." His hand on my elbow guided me into a small office adjacent to the kitchen, closing the door behind us to create privacy from the staff working just outside. "You did well tonight. Followed protocols exactly as instructed, maintained professional demeanor. Didn't show reaction to anything you might have overheard. I'm impressed." His approval shouldn't have mattered as much as it did, but I felt a flush of pride at his words. "Your cousin made me uncomfortable." The words came out before I could reconsider whether this was appropriate timing for such feedback. The way he was looking at me felt predatory. Alessandro's expression darkened, something dangerous flickering behind his controlled exterior. "Vittorio has always had boundary issues. I apologize for his behavior and want you to know that if he contacts you outside of restaurant business, you're to inform me immediately. He understands the rules, but sometimes needs to be reminded of consequences for violating them." What kind of consequences? I was genuinely curious about how Alessandro maintained discipline within an organization that operated outside conventional legal structures, the kind that involved reassignment to less desirable territories and reduced profit participation. "My cousin values money and status above everything else. Threatening those is more effective than physical intimidation." Alessandro moved closer, his presence filling the small office with an energy that made my breath catch. "But I want to be clear about something, Sophie. Anyone who works for me is under my protection, which extends far beyond just workplace issues. If someone threatens you, harasses you, or makes you feel unsafe, that becomes my personal concern. Do you understand?" "I understand." The proximity was doing strange things to my nervous system. Awareness of him as more than just my employer creating complications I wasn't prepared to address. "Thank you for clarifying." "Good. Now, finish your shift and meet me in my car out back in 30 minutes. There's something I need to show you." He was gone before I could ask questions, leaving me alone in the office with my racing heart and a head full of speculation about what might require a midnight meeting. The rest of the service passed without incident. David supervised the breakdown of the private dining room after Alessandro and his guests departed through the kitchen exit, and I helped coordinate the front-of-house closing. Procedures with efficiency that earned approving nods from staff who'd been skeptical about my capabilities. By midnight, Bellissimo was dark except for security lighting and the small crew handling final cleaning tasks. Alessandro's sedan waited in the alley behind the restaurant, the same vehicle that had transported me to the hospital 2 weeks earlier. The driver, whose name I had learned was Marcus, opened the rear door with professional courtesy, and I slid into the leather interior to find Alessandro reviewing documents on a tablet. "Where are we going?" I asked as Marcus pulled away from the restaurant, heading north through Chicago's late-night streets. "Your new apartment. I want to ensure it meets your standards before you move in this weekend." Alessandro set aside the tablet, giving me his full attention. "The building is one of my properties, well-maintained with excellent security. You'll have neighbors who work in various legitimate businesses, mostly young professionals in finance and law. Your cover story, if anyone asks, is that you're a restaurant manager who got a good deal through a connection to the building's owner." Cover story? As if my entire life was now a performance designed to hide the reality of my employment. The thought should have been disturbing, but instead felt oddly liberating, like permission to become someone new. The building was exactly as he'd described, a well-maintained vintage structure in Lincoln Park that had been carefully renovated to preserve historical details while updating essential systems. The lobby featured original tile work and brass fixtures that gleamed under modern lighting, and a security desk manned by a uniformed guard who nodded respectfully as Alessandro led me to the elevators. The apartment was on the 4th floor, a one-bedroom unit that was a silly 3 times the size of my current studio. Hardwood floors gleamed in the light from floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a tree-lined street, and the kitchen featured modern appliances that looked barely used. The furniture was tasteful but minimal, clearly staged rather than lived in, waiting for my personal touches to transform it into an actual home. "This is too much," I said, walking through the space with growing awareness of how dramatically my life was changing. "I don't need something this nice. You need something that reflects your position. Managers of upscale restaurants don't live in studio apartments in questionable neighborhoods. This creates the right impression for anyone who might be watching or investigating." Alessandro moved through the apartment with the ease of someone familiar with the space, opening closets to show storage, demonstrating the security system controls. pointing out amenities I would have never thought to request. The first 6 weeks of managing Bellissimo passed in a blur of learning curves and calculated deceptions. I moved into the Lincoln Park apartment on a Saturday, Melissa helping me transport my meager possessions in 2 carloads that looked pathetic in the spacious rooms. She'd walk through the apartment with barely concealed concern, taking in the high-end finishes and expensive appliances with the analytical eye of someone who understood exactly what kind of employer provided housing like this. This is a golden cage, Sophie. You know that, right? She'd said as we unpacked boxes in the bedroom, her voice low despite the fact that we were alone. He's making you dependent on him, tying your lifestyle to his continued approval. If you ever want to leave, walking away from this will be almost impossible. I know, but I also know that my alternative was drowning in debt while serving pasta to people who treated me like I was invisible. At least this cage has good water pressure and windows that don't let in drafts. I tried for humor, but Melissa's expression remained serious, worried in ways she couldn't quite articulate. Just promise me you'll be careful, that you won't lose yourself in whatever world you're entering. She'd hugged me then, fierce and protective, and I'd held on tighter than I meant to, aware that our friendship would necessarily become more distant as my involvement with Alessandro's organization deepened. The restaurant operations became second nature surprisingly quickly. I learned the rhythms of service, the personalities of staff members, the preferences of regular customers who returned weekly for the consistency of excellent food and impeccable service. The front-of-house team gradually warmed to my management style, which was less authoritarian than David's, but equally insistent on maintaining standards. The kitchen respected my willingness to listen to their concerns while backing them up against unreasonable customer demand. But it was the private dining rooms that revealed the true complexity of my position. The meetings happened 2 or 3 times weekly, always coordinated through Alessandro's encrypted messages that arrived with minimal notice. I learned to recognize the key players in his organization by face and name, understanding without being told who held real power versus who simply carried messages. There was Marco Benedetti, the restaurateur who'd fired Tony at Alessandro's request, his jovial exterior masking a calculating mind that had built an empire of legitimate businesses hiding substantial criminal revenue. Giovanni Costa controlled the southern territories, a quiet man in his 60s who spoke rarely but commanded absolute attention when he did. And of course, Vittorio Russo, Alessandro's cousin, whose predatory gaze followed me through service with an intensity that never quite crossed into actionable harassment but always made my skin crawl. Alessandro himself remained an enigma wrapped in expensive suits and careful control. He was unfailingly professional during my work hours, treating me with the same respectful distance he showed all his employees. But there were moments, brief glimpses of something more personal beneath his carefully maintained facade. The way his hand would linger on my shoulder when he guided me away from conversations I shouldn't overhear. How his gaze would track my movement through the restaurant even when he was supposedly focused on business discussions. The late-night text messages checking if I'd arrived home safely, ostensibly about security but carrying undertones of personal concern that neither of us acknowledged directly. I'd been managing Bellissimo for exactly 42 days when everything changed. It was a Thursday evening, the dinner service running smoothly with all stations functioning at peak efficiency. Private room 1 was reserved for Alessandro and several business associates, a routine booking that I'd handled dozens of times by this point. I just delivered their second course when I noticed tension in the room that felt different from usual business negotiations. Alessandro's posture was rigid, his jaw clenched in a way I'd learned to recognize as barely controlled anger. The 3 men seated across from him were unfamiliar, not part of his regular organization, their body language aggressive in ways that violated the usual protocols of these meetings. Completed my service and retreated as trained, because something made me linger in the kitchen corridor rather than returning to the main dining room. An instinct honed during years of reading social dynamics told me this situation was escalating towards something dangerous. Through the door, I could hear voices rising, the conversation shifting from English to Italian and back again. Words like territory and respect and consequences carrying through the soundproofing. That wasn't quite adequate for genuine shouting. Marcus appeared beside me, Alessandro's driver who doubled as personal security, his expression grim. "You should go back to the dining room, Miss Chun. This doesn't concern you." Who are those men? They're not part of the family. I'd learned enough over the past weeks to recognize when outsiders were violating established protocols. They're representatives from a competing organization trying to renegotiate territorial agreements that have been in place for 20 years. It's not your concern. His hand on my elbow was gentle but insistent, guiding me away from the private dining area. I made it exactly 5 steps before the sound of breaking glass and raised voices erupted from private room 1. Marcus was moving before I'd fully processed what was happening, drawing a weapon from beneath his jacket with practiced efficiency and speaking urgently into a concealed microphone. Within seconds, 2 more security personnel materialized from positions I hadn't even known they occupied, all converging on the private dining room with coordinated precision. "Stay here," Marcus commanded. Then he was through the door and I was left alone in the corridor with my heart racing and my mind mind, processing implications I'd tried very hard not to think about over the past 6 weeks. This was the reality beneath the elegant facade. Violence was always a possibility, lurking under every negotiation and business arrangement, ready to erupt when words failed to resolve disputes. The door opened and Alessandro emerged, his suit jacket torn at the shoulder and a thin line of blood trailing from the corner of his mouth. Behind him, Marcus and the other security personnel were escorting the 3 visitors toward the kitchen, exit with hands gripping arms and weapons not quite concealed. Alessandro's gaze found me immediately, something shifting in his expression when he registered my presence. "Sophie." His voice was controlled despite the visible evidence of physical confrontation. "I need you to call our cleaning service. The code is red, which means extensive work required immediately. Then I need you to manage the dining room for the rest of the evening as if nothing unusual has occurred. Can you do that?" "Yes." The word came out steadier than I felt, autopilot taking over when conscious thought threatened to shut down entirely. "But are you all right? Should I call it a doctor?" "I'm fine. This is minor and will be addressed by our medical staff. What I need from you is absolute normalcy for our other customers. The service cannot be disrupted by internal business matters." His hand touched my cheek briefly, a gesture of reassurance that crossed professional boundaries, but felt necessary in the moment. "You're doing well, Sophie. Better than I'd hoped." The cleaning service arrived within 20 minutes, a team of 5 who worked with the efficiency of people accustomed to erasing evidence of violence from upscale establishments. By the time they'd finished, Private Room 1 showed no signs of the confrontation that had occurred. Every surface pristine, and the broken glass completely vanished. I managed the rest of the dinner service with practiced competence, greeting customers and coordinating courses while my brain churned through what I'd witnessed and what it meant for my continued employment. Alessandro found me in my office after closing, when the last customer had departed and the staff were completing their breakdown routines. He changed clothes, the torn suit replaced by casual slacks and a sweater that made him look younger and somehow more dangerous in its informality. The cut on his lip had been cleaned and treated, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. "We need to talk about what happened tonight." He closed the office door, creating privacy that felt both protective and potentially threatening depending on what came next. I should have been terrified. Every rational part of my brain insisted that witnessing violence in a criminal organization was the moment to reconsider my choice, to extract myself before becoming too deeply entangled in a world where business disputes were resolved with broken glass and bloodshed. Instead, I found myself remarkably calm, analyzing the situation with the same detached observation I'd once applied to Renaissance power struggles in academic papers. "You're not afraid." Alessandro's statement carried surprise and something that might have been approval. Most people in your position would be demanding explanations or threatening to quit. I studied the Italian Renaissance for 4 years. The Medici settled disputes by having entire families assassinated in churches during Easter Mass. What happened tonight was a negotiation that got physical, violent but contained, and ultimately resolved without anyone dying. By historical standards, that's remarkably civilized. I kept my voice steady, projecting confidence I didn't entirely feel but needed him to believe I possessed. Alessandro moved closer, settling against the edge of my desk with that predatory grace that I'd learned, signaled he was processing multiple calculations simultaneously. "Those men represent the Caruso organization, which has been trying to expand into territories my family has controlled for 3 generations. Tonight was supposed to be a peaceful discussion about maintaining existing boundaries. They came with different intentions. They came looking for weakness. They wanted to test whether you'd negotiate from a position of compromise or strength. The pattern was obvious once I understood the dynamics at play." "What did you tell them?" "That the Marchetti family doesn't renegotiate agreements made in good faith, and that further attempts to encroach on our territories would be met with proportionate response. They responded poorly to clarity." His smile was sharp, predatory, the refined businessman replaced by something far more dangerous. "Marcus and my security team provided the emphasis my words required. Will they retaliate?" I'd read enough about organized crime to understand that violence often escalates in predictable pattern, each side responding to perceived slights until the situation spiraled beyond anyone's control. "They'll attempt to save face through some minor gesture, probably targeting one of our peripheral operations where damage can be contained. We've already increased security at vulnerable locations and sent messages to our allies about the situation. Within a week, intermediaries will arrange a sit-down where everyone saves face and boundaries are reaffirmed. This is how these things work when both sides are rational enough to avoid full-scale war, and if they're not rational, the question emerged from genuine concern rather than academic curiosity. I had become invested in Alessandro's safety in ways that went beyond mere employment relationships. Then we eliminate the leadership and negotiate with whoever replaces them, but that's an unlikely outcome. The Crusoes are aggressive but not stupid. They know that open warfare would invite attention from law enforcement and federal agencies, which hurts everyone's business. His hand reached out, fingertips tracing the line of my jaw with unexpected gentleness. "You handled tonight perfectly, Sophie. No panic, no hysteria, just calm competence and the intelligence to understand context. That's exactly why I recruited you." The touch sent electricity through my nervous system, awareness of him shifting from employer to something far more complicated. We were alone in my office after midnight. the restaurant silent around us, and the carefully maintained professional distance we'd observed for 6 weeks was crumbling under the weight of accumulated tension. Alessandro. His name came out as barely a whisper, question and invitation tangled together. Tell me to leave. His other hand found my waist, pulling me closer until barely any space remained between us. Tell me this is inappropriate and crosses lines that shouldn't be crossed between employer and employee. Give me one good reason to maintain the distance I've been forcing myself to keep since the night I found you in that alley. I can't think of a single one. The truth of it settled over me with surprising clarity. I'd stopped trying to maintain separation between my professional life and personal feelings weeks ago. Every interaction with Alessandro adding layers to an attraction I'd been trying desperately to ignore. You're dangerous and manipulative, and you've restructured my entire life to make me dependent on your organization. All true. And you're brilliant and perceptive and far too good for the world I'm offering you. But you're here anyway, making choices that prioritize survival over moral purity. His forehead rested against mine, breath warm against my lips. We're both compromised, Sophie. The question is whether we're compromised together or separately. I closed the remaining distance between us, answering his question with a kiss that carried 6 weeks of suppressed attraction and the adrenaline aftermath of witnessing violence I couldn't quite process. His response was immediate and intense, hands tangling in my hair as he deepened the kiss with a hunger that matched my own. We were playing with fire in every possible sense, crossing boundaries that would make my position infinitely more complicated. But in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to care about consequences. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alessandro's smile was genuine in ways I'd rarely seen from him. This changes things between us. Everything already changed the night you intervened in that alley. This just makes it explicit. I straightened my clothing, attempting to regain some semblance of professional composure despite what had just occurred. So what happens now? Now you finish your shift reports and go home to your apartment. Tomorrow you continue managing Bellissimo with the same competence you've shown for the past 6 weeks. And tomorrow night you have dinner with me somewhere that isn't this restaurant, where we can be Alessandro and Sophie rather than boss and employee. He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. If you're going to be part of my life, truly part of it, you need to understand everything, not just the sanitized version I've shown you so far. I'm not sure I want to understand everything. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. But even as I said it, I knew I was lying. I wanted to understand him completely, to map every shadow and secret that made Alessandro Marchetti who he was. The following night, I met Alessandro at a small Italian restaurant in a neighborhood I didn't recognize, the kind of place that didn't advertise or maintain a website but somehow stayed perpetually full through word of mouth and old connections. He was waiting at a corner table, dressed casually in ways that made him look less like a crime boss and more like any successful businessman enjoying an evening out. This was my grandmother's restaurant. Alessandro gestured at the modest surroundings with obvious affection. She ran it for 40 years before retiring, taught me everything important about hospitality and respect. It's where I learned that power isn't about intimidation, it's about making you feel valued and protected. We talked for hours, conversation flowing from my childhood in suburban Minneapolis to his years in Rome learning the family business, from my abandoned dreams of museum curation to his careful expansion of Marchetti operations into legitimate enterprises that could sustain future generations. He told me about his mother who died when he was 17 in a car accident that might not have been accidental, about the weight of family expectations and the isolation of leadership. I told him about my father's disappointment when I'd chosen art history over something practical, about the student loans that had buried me before I'd even started my career, about the quiet desperation of watching dreams dissolve under the pressure of economic reality. By the time we left the restaurant after midnight, I understood something fundamental had shifted between us. This wasn't just employer and employee anymore. It wasn't even just attraction and opportunity. We'd become something more complicated. Two people who'd found unexpected connection in circumstances that should have made intimacy impossible. 3 months later, I stood in private room 1 coordinating a meeting between Alessandro and representatives from 5 different families, my role having evolved from manager to trusted advisor whose presence in sensitive negotiations was not just tolerated but valued. I'd learned to read the subtle dynamics of power, to anticipate when discussions needed intervention before they escalate, to provide the kind of intelligent observation that came from understanding both criminal enterprise and Renaissance political theory. Melissa had been right about the golden cage, but what she hadn't understood was that sometimes cages are chosen rather than imposed. I'd walked into Alessandro's world with open eyes, trading one kind of constraint for another, accepting moral compromises in exchange for stability and purpose that conventional society had never offered. Was it the right choice? I still didn't know, but it was my choice, made with full awareness of its implications. Alessandro found me after the meeting concluded successfully, his hand finding the small of my back in a gesture that had become familiar over months of carefully hidden intimacy. You were brilliant tonight. The observation about territorial overlap prevented what could have become a serious dispute. I had a good education. I smiled up at him, feeling the weight of my choices settle more comfortably. It turns out studying dead Italians prepared me perfectly for managing live. His laugh was genuine, warm, the sound of someone who'd found unexpected joy in circumstances that should have been purely purely transactional. Come home with me tonight, stay. I already am home. The truth of it settled over me with surprising peace. Wherever you are is home now. The golden cage had become something else entirely, something I'd helped build from the inside, and I discovered I had no desire to escape it after all.